Queen Elizabeth shows up in disguise to a theater performance of Shakespeare. And they're going in to arrest this actor for being a woman playing a woman when you're supposed to be a man playing a woman. And she throws off her disguise, and all of a sudden, what does everybody do? Start bowing and taking off their hats, and everybody instinctively drops to the floor and starts kneeling and all kinds of things, which is incredible, actually. And it teaches us something about the state of mind in this kind of European setting. When one of my graduate school advisors quoted the historian Eric Hobsbawm as saying that something to the effect that in European society, the social order was as natural as the sun rising and the sun setting. There was no questioning that you had to bow before the king or the queen or whoever it was that was walking down. You just did it automatically. It was instinctual. It seemed like the perfectly natural thing to do. It didn't seem any different than living in a landscape of rocks and trees and suns rising. That was just part of the natural landscape. But it brings up a huge question, which is, how in the world did people get the idea that life in a state of nature was life in a state of equality, right? We've been thinking about Rousseau and other Europeans who began to assume that social life was egalitarian before there was, before there was the social life, I should say, that it was everybody being equal, which is a pretty strange idea to come out of Europeans, because as we've just seen, they would have assumed that everything was entirely unequal. That was the natural order of things as far as they were concerned. So why would they start to ask this question about the origins of inequality when it seems so obvious that the world was entirely unequal? So this is the question that Graeber and Wengrow pose toward the beginning of this chapter, which is how the Europeans came to believe that there was ever a state of equality when their society was completely hierarchically organized. Now, they do admit that there were some precursors in European thought to, it wasn't that equality was completely outside of European thought. There were some precursors to that, or ideas that they could have drawn on. One of them were the various festivals, Carnival, Mardi Gras, what we're experiencing now for those of you in the Catholic tradition, you know, these times when everything would go kind of topsy-turvy and the rich would have to bow before the poor and the poor would anoint themselves kings and party in the streets. Men would be dressing like women, women like men. Everything went crazy for a while. So this was a time of exuberance, and people would draw upon it as this kind of state of not necessarily a state of nature, but certainly going back to the pre-times. There's been a long debate in history and anthropology about whether these kinds of carnivalesque exuberances were a true questioning of the social system, or were they simply people blowing off steam for a while, having a big party, you know, dumping flour everywhere, and then you could go back to normal life because you'd gotten it out of your system. I think that in some ways it could be both, right? Oftentimes it functioned as a way of people getting it out of their systems, but sometimes it would go over the edge and people would start to form more revolutionary ideas because of it. So that was a possible precursor. Graeber and Wengrow also mentioned that there was also the notion that everyone was equal before some kind of omnipotent person. So in some cases you might say you're equal before the Lord, as in God. So everyone is equal before God, but God is above all. But the Lord could also mean the king or the queen, so that in some ways there is one person who has all the power and everyone else has no power in that sense. But even if, and I think Graeber and Wengrow are correct, that even if they had, it wasn't that the notion of equality was absent from European thought, but there was no reason in European society to think that there was ever a pre-existing natural state of equality. It wasn't that the idea was completely foreign, but why would they think, especially given the inequalities and hierarchies and social pecking order of European society, why would they think that this was a thing that had always pre-existed? So, where did the Europeans get this idea? Well, according to Graeber and Wengrow, they got the idea from what they call American intellectuals. Now, by American, they mean the old sense of American, as in people who lived in the Americas. They do not mean us Americans. They mean people who lived in the Americas. We would call them indigenous or Native Americans, but American intellectuals influencing the European tradition. And they make the statement on page 37, says, we will suggest that there is a reason why so many key Enlightenment thinkers insisted that their ideals of individual liberty and political equality were inspired by Native American sources and examples. So many of the people that we read, people read in the Enlightenment in this period, were writing these kinds of ideas about human society, and they would say that they were inspired by Native American ideas. We will suggest that there is a reason why. What would they suggest is the reason? We will suggest that there is a reason why so many of these Enlightenment thinkers said that they got their ideas from Native American sources. I'll just say the opposite, which is that a lot of people have said that these Enlightenment thinkers were simply making it up, that they made up these examples because they were trying to, in their day, hide their radical ideas. And so one way to hide your radical ideas, you say, well, I didn't say it, that person said it, and so, I can't get in trouble. I'm just quoting somebody from off the way. So many people today have said, no, they weren't actually inspired. But Graeber and Wengrow says, because it was true. One of the shortest sentences in their book, by the way, only 4 words long. Basically, they're saying, we believe that in fact, the Enlightenment thinkers were inspired by Native American thinkers. They really were, that they really got at least their initial inspiration for that came from this area. And I will say that this has been something that others, historians of the Enlightenment, have said is wrong, but they make a pretty good case for it. Now, where most of these come from, what was called at the time New France. I just wanted to show you New France during its heyday. I got this from a map, which is New France during its heyday. And I think it's important to sort of think about this, especially those of us who have grown up in various parts of the United States, that when the Brits were arriving, they were really in some ways the latecomers and only had a small amount of territory in comparison to what the French had at the time. In its heyday, New France was one of the largest political territories in the world, maybe the largest. As you can see, they have all of the Great Lakes completely covered, all those places we now know of as Detroit, Fort Detroit, right? That was a French place, like a French and Native American, but they had occupied this. And of course, we know about New Orleans and Louisiana and the Louisiana Purchase. And if you've been in my class, you know that one of the reasons for the Louisiana Purchase was actually the Haitian Revolution, which ended Napoleon's imperial ambitions in the Americas. But for a very long time, the French were in control of a lot of North America, a large territory, and we're going to be thinking about these people in the area of the Great Lakes and in what is now Quebec, where of course they do still speak French. But in this area, and they're especially going to be drawing on people that they refer to as the Wendat. They are sometimes called the Huron, but that's kind of a derogatory term. So we'll go with the Wendat. But this was a huge area of the world, New France. So what I asked you to do in this class is to think about what the people in New France, the indigenous people to the Americas, thought of the French. Matt, what did they think of the French? What was their opinion of the French? They did not like the French. Now, one could say that they simply did not like the French because the French had come to establish rule and were beating them up and being mean to them. But they went beyond just not liking the French. What did they think of French society?
They thought that they kind of just didn't believe anything that they believed. The morals and everything like that were different. Yeah, they organized their lives differently.
Yeah, they certainly had a way of organizing their lives which was different, and they thought of the French, the indigenous people, started to say that the French way of organizing things was inferior to their own. Now, again, this is a little bit different, right? You can, if somebody's dominating you, you cannot like them because you don't like them, right? You don't like being dominated. But in some cases, you're like, all right, well, fine. You got the guns, you got the stuff, you have more material possessions, you're superior. But they said, no, you may have some more material possessions, you may have some different technologies, but your social organization and your way of life is inferior than to our own. And in fact, we are richer than you because we don't have as many people who are begging or in poverty, and we share among ourselves. So we are in fact richer than you are. And this drove the French crazy. Now, of course, this was based upon, we do have to remember that most of the time, the people they saw from French society were not the people who lived in France or in Paris or in Europe. They were mainly getting their impressions from merchants and soldiers and trappers who were mostly guys and probably had come there to make money or to, make their way in the world. They probably didn't have a lot of family connections. So you could say that their view of the French was in part based on a subsection of French society. But the arguments that they had, these arguments that get written down as were recorded by Jesuit missionaries. And the Jesuits thought of themselves and truly were really the smartest Catholics, you might say. They were the ones who had studied, they learned indigenous languages, they learned biblical texts, obviously. They also learned ancient philosophies. And their idea was that they could convince people to adopt the Christian faith. So they weren't trying to subjugate them into it. They were trying to convince them, to argue them into it. And in fact, if even today, if you look at many of our contemporary colleges and universities, they were either founded by or are still run by the Jesuit order. They really had this kind of emphasis on education and being the smartest in the faith and able to convert people. And so they're having these arguments, and the Jesuits were not always, they didn't seem to always be able to win, or they were frustrated in what the indigenous people retorted or argued against them for. Liz, what was the argument about here? What was the first argument that they were having? Yeah. Yeah, that was the first thing. The Jesuits were kind of impressed that they seemed to be smarter than the ones that they were used to. And so that was one of the things that frustrated them. So that they're smarter than they were used to. And they didn't like the argument. The argument, Graeber and Wengrow argues that the argument was first about the idea of freedom and liberty, and how people should be able to conduct themselves in terms of being free or not. Felicia, what do the Europeans think about freedom and liberty at the time? Huh? They were opposed to freedom and liberty. So this is an interesting thing, because these days we all think everybody says they're in favor of freedom now. Whatever you are, nobody says I'm against freedom. Everybody loves freedom now. But back in the day, the Europeans were very either afraid of or opposed to people being free. They saw that as a problem, and they didn't want to encourage people to be free or have too much liberty. Yeah, man.
I guess they treated us like almost. I don't know. I'm trying to think about it.
Yeah, I mean, remember they're trying to convert people into the Catholic Church, and if people are just doing all this freedom stuff, it's not going to work. I mean, you saw Queen Elizabeth. You can't have people just doing what they want all over the place. You got to have them bowing at the right time. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I mean, they are basically saying you need a strong ruler to keep people. If they don't, they're going to do bad things. They're going to do bad things to each other. So, they saw this as and like Graeber and Wengrow says, it kind of messes with our heads because we see freedom as a good thing, right? And they saw it as a dangerous thing. This actually happened to me during my own field work, and I was in rural Colombia, and I was asking people. I did some surveys with people, and I just asked them, like, well, what's different about today as compared to when you were growing up? And people would be like, yeah, more freedom today, more freedom. I was like, okay, good. And then they were like, no, not good. Because it was like, the kids aren't obeying their parents, they're doing things too early, and they're out, you can't control anybody. So you just always have to be careful of the value that we place on freedom. The indigenous thinkers, the people who are arguing against the Jesuits, they seem to say, yes, we have more freedom, and that is the way that things should be. And this was a challenge to European order, because the Europeans wanted to be able to at least, they wanted to be able to argue with people, but they also wanted to be able to coerce people into doing what was right by the law. And so another example concerned the idea of justice. So let's go back to the example of Cyrus punches me in the nose. If I take Cyrus to court, what should happen? Who gets punished? Cyrus, yes. The guilty, right? Liz, what happened in indigenous societies? Cyrus punches me in the nose. Who gets punished? His family. Cyrus walks away free. But his family, his lineage, or his extended clan, you might say, has to pay me compensation, or my kin compensation. What does that mean they're going to do to Cyrus? If every time I go out and hit somebody or hurt somebody, my family or my kin has to pay all the people in that family for what I did, what are they going to do to me? They're going to keep me in line. They may not beat me up, but they're certainly going to stop me from going out and hitting people all the time, right? So, they might do something. So the thing is in the indigenous society, they would say that you could even murder somebody and walk away free. You'd still be free, but all your kin have to pay a massive amount of compensation to the family of the people who's been murdered. They're not going to let that happen again, or they might not let that happen at all. And so in general, the Jesuits admit that even though there isn't a coercive form of law, you can't throw anybody in prison, it nevertheless serves to keep order in this society. Something else that frustrated the Jesuits and Europeans was the gender relationships, right? Felicia, what bothered them about women? Their sexual liberties. Yeah, maybe this is perhaps one reason why many Europeans preferred to live in indigenous societies, but for the Jesuits, this was a big problem, that women had control over their own bodies and they controlled their property, and they were scandalized by this. This was not a good thing for them. So they were scandalized by this. We could actually even take this further than Graeber and Wengrow talk about in this book. In this area of the Americas is where, and in our area of the Americas, is where many of the indigenous groups have what today some groups have reappropriated as what they call two-spirit peoples. People who are born biologically of one sex, but take on the social role of the other. So people who are biologically male, but would perform special tasks and might look socially like females, or in some cases, people who are biologically female, but take on the social roles of men or have special roles in their lives. So this is something that, people get all excited about transgender, and they say, oh my gosh, it's all happening today. But this is actually a fairly ancient idea among many societies, especially in the Americas, indigenous to the Americas. Now, the French actually called this berdache, which is a derogatory term for a male prostitute. They didn't know what to call it. So they came up with something that is probably a I think it was a derogatory term for a homosexual male prostitute. But this term then entered into the anthropological literature, unfortunately. And so if you look up old anthropologists who are studying this, they sometimes refer to it as burdash. But again, this is actually a derogatory term for what was socially accepted as a third or fourth gender role in these societies. They did not conform to necessarily two genders. So I mentioned this because we could even push Graeber and Wengrow a little bit further in this, in that this was if you can imagine, in some ways, the indigenous societies of the Americas in what was New France had ideas about gender and about the relationships of gender and biology, which were way far in advance, or more allowing for freedom and liberty than what the French had at the time. And as you saw from Shakespeare in Love, people could get arrested simply for not being what they were supposed to be, in the wrong profession, as it were. At the end of this section, they began to tell us about something that we'll talk about, is how this idea of freedom then became more associated with arguments about equality. And so they talk about what the liberty and mutual aid, or what is freedom and communism. And this is a little bit of a complicated section here, so I just wanted to go through it a little bit. What they say is that when we usually think of communism, it's as communal ownership, right? Everybody owns the means of production. And there was a whole argument that came out of New France and the Iroquois. And the idea was that in this society, they had what they called, what Engels called primitive communism. That people had everything in common. But they say that that actually does not resemble what the indigenous American societies were doing. That there was a different sense of communism, though. That communism can also mean something, a very famous quote, from each according to their abilities, to each according to their needs. So the idea is we all do what we can according to our abilities, but people's needs get satisfied. And in this version of communism, it doesn't necessarily mean that everybody has to be equal. Obviously, people will have different abilities and different needs, but simply people who have their needs, if you have needs, they will be met. This is an interesting phrase. It comes to us from the Communist Manifesto, but if you survey people in the United States, approximately a good percentage of people in the United States believe that this is in the Constitution. So just, you can throw it out there because it sounds nice, from each according to their abilities, each according to their needs, but it is actually from the Communist Manifesto. And so what Graeber and Wengrow say is that for indigenous societies, what that meant is that if somebody needed food, if somebody was asking you for food, you had to give them food. That was just part of it. That was part of life, is that you could not refuse a request for food, and you might not even be able to refuse a request for shelter. If someone was not unable to be sheltered, then you had to give it to them. It doesn't mean that people were equal. It just meant that if someone was asking for food and you had food, you had to share it with them. And what they say is that for the Europeans at the time, they saw it as okay to refuse a request for food, and probably especially okay to refuse a request for shelter, which is probably still true in our world today, right? But this would scandalize the Native Americans, that you could refuse someone who is asking for food would be beyond the pale of human interaction. And that was one of the things that one of the reasons they thought the French system was inferior to their own. So we get to the end of this section. And some of you have read a little bit further than you needed to, but that's okay because we'll catch up on Tuesday. So for Tuesday, we'll finish this chapter. And what they say at the end of this section is that indigenous societies in the Americas were organized to ensure that no one's will would be subjugated to that of anyone else, prioritizing liberty and freedom. And as a condition of that, you had to be able to have food. That was one of the kind of conditions of liberty, was being able to have the means, because obviously if you don't have food and you have to subjugate yourself to somebody else in order to get food, then you don't actually have freedom.